Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, yeah, it's fine.
Okay, cool. So this is Erathsmus with SoCal GG for the part two of our summer Smackdown tournament. And here I've got Tlaloc and Yoshi to go over their choices for middle age and late age, which I believe, Tlaloc, you're with Vanheim, and Yoshi, you're with Agartha, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So just to start this off, I'm going to look at who we've got in this lobby over here. So it looks like we've got, for Tlaloc, we've got a couple picks in here that were on the 1 point scale. I think our middle-aged nations kind of had a few of the um, more challenging picks. That best way I could explain it across the ages. We've got Ermor in there, Yis, Riley, and Vanheim as sort of the tougher nuts to crack, so to say. Do you think you're going to get any aggro for it in the lobby, Tlaloc, or do you think everyone's going to have their hands full with some of these other picks?
Don't know. It's difficult to say. This nation is very interesting because I played a middle-aged Vanheim in Lucid's qualifier for the tournament, and it was also MA, and it was a completely different nation roster to this. The only overlapping nations are Ind, Agartha, and Yes with that game. So my sort of perception of what's good and what's not good versus Vanheim is like it's hard to like really I just don't really know. I think that I might get a bit of grief, but there are also other cancer nations. So there's Yes, there's Ind, there's Ermor. Hopefully Ermor is just going to be a magnet for people around to be really concerned about.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
I
human.
just saw the
Sorry, go on.
map get rolled yesterday, and it's gonna be interesting. I think a lot of the diplomacy going on in the lobby is potentially gonna get really weird and potentially very cancerous.
That's not what I wanted you to tell me. How many lakes are there? That's also a big, big question. There's
One
just one
big
lake, right?
ocean.
Okay.
And there's not too many sprinklings of other lakes, but there is a big ocean.
Does Ermor also border the ocean?
Yeah.
That's not huge.
So
That's not that much info because pretty much everyone, there's like half the people border the ocean or in the ocean. So that's kind of interesting, right? Because Ermor can actually get into the ocean, unlike basically everyone else.
yeah, when I saw it, I was like, "Oh my god, what if all three of these players decide to just, be like, let's not fight each other."
I actually think that's the play. I actually think, I mean, let's just ignore Ermor, but I think if you're two people in a pond in Map Nuke, trying to, it's just like a red queen like arms race, right? You can both like completely destroy your build and you're blessed to kill the other person, but you kind of have a very real chance of just sinking your entire game.
Yeah, I
Who
agree
is one of these
completely.
players? If I was one of these players, I'd just be like, look, let's just be friends forever. Both of them don't want to be underwater. They both want to get onto land. So Yes does not want to fight underwater. Like they just don't care. They want to get onto land and get their good units on land.
I think there's I agree completely, and that's something where when people talk about underwater nations, that I think they talk about like ideal gameplay or something like that, where they're like, oh, it always is an underwater knife fight, right? That's always how it plays out. If you play it any other way, it's going to go wrong. But no, when I see underwater players, when they're just like, oh, it's fine. We'll be neighbors and we could just be as toxic as possible from our giant ocean. Um, sure, eventually it comes down to a fight, but I've seen it where they're just like, let's just fight each other at the end. And it gets really hard to fight them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially because none of the thrones are underwater usually. So it's like you fight this huge epic war, completely destroy your bless, spend all your early game resources, not really building forts, not building so many mages, and then you just get like one other cap. And it's like fighting underwater is just miserable. And it's just a waste of time, I think, a lot of the time. It's why one of your questions you sent to me was how are you going to deal with the underwater nations? I'll tell you how I'm going to deal with them. I'm not going to deal with them. I'm not going to fight them. I'm not going to mount a amphibious invasion of the sea.
Well, so what's going to happen though if let's just say like the underwater nations and or more just decide let's all be friends. What are you going to do to even be able to place top 4 if they're taking on the lobby?
That is a very real possibility. I definitely think that, especially after the first, maybe even before the first war, there'll be little coalitions because there's 11 players. That means one coalition is left out if they're all 4 players. But I don't know if they really team up. Hopefully, I don't border the 2 of them if that happens. I think I would be happy to fight Ermor, but if they try, like I think I can hold them in the sea. Like no one wants to fight Vanheim early, and I'm hopefully what I can do is if they come onto the land, I'm just going to immediately kick them back into the sea and be like, "We're napping, but you're not building anything on this side of the lake. You need to go to the other side of the lake." That's my plan, but that can be tricky. If I'm bordering 2 of them, or if Yis comes in like real force to fight me over that, it could be really tricky.
Yeah, I think middle age. It's funny. I looked at early age and I was like, ooh, the players look kind of tough across the board, and there's a lot of rush nations, and I'm going a not so good nation against rushes. But when I saw middle age, I was like, oh, their ability to just Diplo kind of hold out on here is pretty nasty looking. So, and Abyssia is in that lobby. Oh boy, Abyssia just sounds so rough to play in that lobby.
Yeah, I know Selgron quite well. So to be honest, if there's going to be these coalitions, I'm probably going to try and get Selgron into my coalition. Unless I literally am next to him, I probably will just try and get Selgron into my coalition, just go to know him a bit better. You're talking about the Cancer nations, but my real concern and the thing I'm trying to work out in my bless is really these humanoid nations, because they've got Ulm, Man, Marignon, Ind, Agartha, even Abyssia, all super high protection human units with big armies. It's kind of a nightmare to actually fight as elves a lot of the time. If you just don't do enough damage to get through the protection, you're in big trouble in battles. And everyone has that in this game, pretty much.
Yeah, I think Marignon is going to be definitely a pain in the butt as time goes on.
Yeah,
that's not any new news, but just your comment on the protection sort of thing. Yeah, it could get pretty rough with them, with Agartha. And we'll see. That's kind of the bizarre pick. It should be kind of cool to see them in play, but Ind doesn't have the best track record, so we'll see.
Yeah, Ind has a lot going on. There's a great guide online for Ind called The Tower of Power. I think
I've seen that one at some point, yeah.
I kind of like it. I think with Ind, you just got to pick your angle. You've just got to pick a few cool things the nation does and lean into those and not get like lost in the sauce like some people do and try and do everything and hire like all the wacky little units they can get. You just got to pick a nice. Usually, in my opinion, you should just go for the blood guys, the Cynocephalians or whatever they're called. Just do blood, do like a nice big stat build on your sacreds, and just go with that and ignore all the other stuff. Don't get the weird dogs. Don't get the crossbowmen. Don't get all the weird femini mages.
We'll see, man. If it's Ind, then chances are it's going to be weird.
Yeah, it's going to be weird.
So, what's your overall strategy for landing in the top 4 to qualify for the finals?
Well, I put together a spreadsheet of the points available, and I reckon you need to be pretty solidly guaranteed. You probably need like a couple of thrones, so like 2 or 3 thrones, and then 2 or 3 caps.
Yep.
So that's my play is fairly. I think in that respect, it's how I usually play. I'll just try and win a quick early war as Vanheim, take their cap, secure the thrones nearby, and then kind of build up a bit. But I'm not sure how it's going to interact with the Diplo situation, because I do think these coalitions, if people don't already realize that this is probably a meta, people will realize pretty quickly if people form like the Hell Coalition or something. I think the coalition building is probably going to be really important. You want to be in a winning 4-person coalition. So I'm probably going to extend feelers pretty quickly. Luckily, as Vanheim, you get to know who your neighbors are really fast because you expand so quickly and you get good vision up. So I'll probably try and get into a coalition. But I'm happy to betray a four-person coalition to get into the top four, or just do a throne rush to win when we're in a good position. You could coordinate throne rushes by people in a four-person team giving away their thrones to someone so they can win.
Yeah, that's true. That can come up.
So that's
way to
something I'm
just
gonna be
shut down
looking for.
other people being able to enter the top four too.
Yeah, like if your coalition's in the top four, just do an organized throne rush where you just seed the thrones necessary. Like it would be super easy, right? Because you don't even need to. You just need to destroy a couple of the forts. One person moves a couple of holy threes around and claims them all. No one.
I think
you could do it
vision
very
on the
quickly.
map and getting to having a rough idea for like the count that other players have is going to be critical for being able to execute those like coalition type victories.
Which maybe is why Ind would be a great partner, right? Because they have the ability to put holy threes all over the place. Which I never thought about until this moment, but maybe I do need to be friends with Ind. Or someone else with a holy three, like easy holy threes.
So this is, I think this is a good transition actually to Yoshi, to some of the questions I had for you. So what sort of Diplo do you think you need to do for this lobby in particular? Anything in particular to LA Agartha you think you'll need to do with regards to handling your Diplo in the late age? And let me pull that late age up really quick.
While I'm pulling that up, you can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so for the late age, I love this question, by the way, because I think Diplo is, probably one of the most important parts of the game. Some people choose to ignore it, but I don't think you could completely ignore it, especially with what you guys were just talking about, that, pretty big coalitions could form early on, especially with this point system. And that could lead to some interesting results too. So coming out of the gate, I don't really have any solid nations that I want to form a coalition with. I guess it depends on how we spawn on the map and who the neighbors are. I do, as Agartha, Agartha is slow. It's one of their weaknesses. So before I go into my first war, I definitely want to set up some naps, or maybe an early coalition with the nations that are on my flanks. That way I could focus all my effort on the first war and not have to worry too much about my backside. But that could easily backfire too. I think at this level, people would know that Agartha is slow, and if I need to rotate my armies to get to my flanks, that I could be in some pretty big trouble. That's something I'll have to watch out for. I don't know very many of the other players. In fact, I don't think I've played with any of them before. But that also means they haven't played with me, so that they probably don't know what I'm capable of, and I don't know what they're capable of either. And honestly, I think I'm probably a pretty solid intermediate player. I don't think I'm an advanced player by any means, but if I could maybe show an initial good expansion, or plot out that first war and form some alliances, maybe I could convince them that I'm a slightly stronger player than what I actually am. Sneak into a good coalition.
Interesting. So do you think you're kind of working from a back leg on that, being LA Agartha?
Slightly, just because with Agartha and with the magic paths they have available, being slow is one thing, but you don't have very many options for magic phase movement. You get some astral, but you have to do some work to get up to astral 3. You don't have access to air. So I geared my pretender in a way that has basically a rainbow, so that I have access to those paths where I could use my pretender as basically like a nuke and drop him in whatever he needs to be, wherever he needs to be.
Yeah, so I saw you were thinking of running the Demi-Lich, right?
Yeah, correct. Demi-Lich, full rainbow across the board, squeeze in some scales wherever I can, and then a bunch of resistances and defense skill in my blast.
Yeah, I've got a pretty similar, no, kind of similar-ish build. At least I'm running the Demi-Lich too, so yeah, I definitely feel you on trying to use them as a kind of nice nuke button later to help leverage lack of easy magic phase access. So I definitely hear you on that.
Yeah, and that was the hardest decision for me, was to go dormant or imprisoned. Imprisoned gave me a lot more flexibility, but I'm not sure if I should have went dormant just to get them earlier. Hopefully I'm in a good situation at that point in the game where I don't need to rely on somebody at the dormant stage, but if I can make it to when my imprisoned Demi-Lich comes online, then I should be in good shape. Or maybe the game will be over before that point, depending on throne rushes and whatnot.
What turn do you guys think the game's gonna probably end for your lobbies?
It's very hard to say. I'm kind of gambling on it ending early. That's my thinking. Early. Well, I say early. I say like before turn 60. But it depends. There could be a stalemate, and who knows what's going to happen. To be honest.
Yeah, I think my lobby is gonna go really fast. There's a lot of pretty fast nations in there. Middle age, it looks like it's gonna go a while. We'll see about it. And late age, I have no idea really. What do you think, Yoshi? When do you think yours is gonna end?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think mine might end before turn 60, so I haven't put too much weight into the late game. But if it does go to the late game, that's where I'm hoping my imprisoned Demi-Lich can start to show, his power. But we have a lot of nations that are scored at a point value 2, which might even things out. There could be some early rushes, like if Gath goes with a Hellbless build and tries to snipe somebody immediately, people could start to snowball. There's late age Ulm. If they manage to get their vampires online as soon as possible, they could start to snowball. That doesn't necessarily mean the game will end early. It could just put a giant target on their backs, and then they get beaten up by other nations or other coalitions.
So in terms
it
of
could
that
shift
snowball
around.
comment, what are you leaning on in terms of snowballing to really push yourself ahead as Agartha?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So my overall strategy is to just grab the points I need and hold on to 4th place at least. I think that's fairly doable. Maybe capture another capital, capture a couple thrones, and then just use my extra siege bonus and my forts to lock everything down as much as I can. So what I'm really leaning on is, after the expansion, I'm going to switch to my national summons, which are undead, and with my mages, basically form an undead army and march that undead army around the map. It's not necessarily faster, but I think the front line of blind fighters, my undead summons like umbrals, and my back line of mages casting battle-wide spells, I think will be fairly decent, at least to grab that bare minimum that I need to squeeze into 4th place and then just lock it in. So that's what I'm thinking.
I do like how those blind fighters are recruit anywhere. It's not like they're Knights of the Chalice, but it is really cool that you could pick them up and you can supplement them in pretty much any army. So are you thinking of using them in terms of scaling into later game, or are you not leveraging the blind fighter too much? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, not too much. I do plan to leverage them, and that's part of the reason why I have such a defensive bless with all the resistances and some defense skill. Undying for extra hit points. I just want them to hold that front line as long as possible to give my mages a chance to cast as much as they can, or battle-wide spells until the turn timer ticks down. Maybe some fatigue plays. We'll see what happens.
Gotcha. So I do want to turn the questions over to you guys now. If you had any questions that were interesting that you wanted to throw my way, I think. Let me get this pulled up. I'm just pulling something up in the background if I need to share my screen. So yeah, feel free to ask away.
I guess my question is, are we going to blitz out the first, I don't know, 20 turns? Because I actually think this will have a huge impact on the game if we blitz out. Because if you're blitzing, it's way harder to do like Diplo and coalition organizing if you have to do a turn every like 20 minutes or something.
I don't think realistically we'll actually be able to blitz like that because of everyone's time zone differences. So it would be nice. I think we're going to be lucky if we get 3 turns in one day for our blitz days.
It's still pretty fast.
I think
I got distracted by some Diplo that just came in.
Oh, no,
no, I did some feelers, but everyone's like, I don't do Diplo before the game. I'm like, fine. I'll wait. Yeah, the blitzing would be interesting, but yeah, obviously getting 12 or 11 people together is difficult to quickly blitz at the start. But even 3 turns a day, the 12-hour games are really fast that we've played sometimes on Immersion. In fact, quite a few people in my lobby have been in the 12-hour games with me before. And it does add a different tempo. It means when people are like slipping, they slip way harder, because they don't have the time to like get their act together, to do the Diplo, to build the coalitions. It's really easy for quick games to slide out of control, I think, which will be great content for this tournament qualifier.
Yeah, I really do like those styles of games. Like even 5-minute turns is something that I'm very fond of. But personally, I'm more like that just because I like turns to go quickly. I'm not too big of a fan of taking 3 hours a day to do each of your turns and test everything here and there and then find out half your testing was wrong when you go to execute it, that sort of stuff. I personally think a lot of the anxiety goes away when you end up blitzing.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, but I definitely think that you don't have this big emotional investment. If you spend like hours and hours or days of your time doing all this scripting and Diplo and you just lose, I don't think you have that emotional investment if you're blitzing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But on the other hand, if you make slip, like you don't have the time to review stuff. So if you're slipping up, it feels bad if you just make one big mistake early on.
Yeah, I think you definitely have to rely on what you'd call more back of the napkin math. Like, just getting what you can out of that short period of time by looking at some quick numbers or just, having on reference what some of those matchups might look like. Because, yeah, you don't have time to test it all through or to come up with several alternative strategies for each move you're making.
That's true. But then, I've played a lot of Middle-Aged Vanheim, and I think in a couple of hours, I could script any battle on Middle-Aged Vanheim. And sorry, if the total time between turns was 3 hours or something. So the thing, I think being on a nation you're super familiar with is really good for fast games. Because if you're playing in for the first time, you're going to get so lost doing like trying to work out what to do all the time.
Oh yeah, and mixed paths too. It's just like, oh, there's this summon I could have used, there's this spell I could have used, and it's very, very easy to lose track of just your rock or paper in your game of rock paper scissors when you're trying to do those turns pretty quickly.
Exactly. I'm very excited though. I think our game, like you said, I think it's gonna be a mess, and it's gonna be good content, and it's gonna be fun no matter what happens. Hopefully, I do get through.
Yeah, same. I'm hoping to get through the first 20 turns. So Yoshi, do you have any questions on your end?
Yeah, I guess. What attracts you to Dominions more than any other game? Besides maybe the obvious where you could take one turn a day at your own pace.
Yeah, I think in terms of what attracts me to the game, aside from the graphics not being super crazy, because I'm personally a lower graphics kind of person. I like that sort of stuff. Dominions and Dwarf Fortress are some of my more close to the heart games, I guess. But outside of that, I really like the 20-dimensional chess aspect of it. It's one of those games, and Dwarf Fortress is one of those games where no matter how much you keep learning, there's more interesting and unique mechanics to explore and to apply in cool ways. So for me, that's really the big part, is that each time I pick up and play it and change my nation or change my overall strategy, it feels really different. And all the different players that go into that multiplayer experience, it's very unique on a kind of human level, I guess, in that a lot of games don't have those variables that are it's so it's hard to explain. It really paints the picture of how those players use those nations. So in some games, like you could play a certain meta of that nation, and it almost always looks the same. Or like you're playing a shooter and someone's just good at playing that shooter, and it starts to feel very similar to the way other players would play it. But in Dominions, you'll have someone pick up a nation, and now your opponent is also different every single time that someone picks them up, and it could be vastly different. Like we were talking about Ind earlier, there's like 20, 30 different ways you could see them come at you. It might not be the most ideal way that they could have picked it, and maybe the ideal way maybe dilutes it down to, or sorry, dilute I guess is the wrong word, concentrates it down to two or three strategies, but it keeps it really different every time. Working with those other players, it's different every time, and the strategies you could do yourself is different too. And it kind of goes both ways too, where I think one of the challenges with Dominions is because it's so variable, it could be kind of unfair at times, or feel that way. Like RNG will just decide to kick you between the legs. But that's a part that keeps it dynamic and keeps it cool, because otherwise, someone's going to win consistently every single time with the same strategy on a certain nation. So that's what I think keeps me interested in it. And because of that human aspect, the community is pretty interesting too. I don't think there is a community quite like Dominions, where they're so technically involved on the gameplay level, but it's also fairly personal as well. Like when you go to war in Dominions, like you're fighting someone for like maybe a month in real life time, and it's just very interesting how that dynamic feels.
Yeah, I agree with that too. That's one of the reasons I like Dominions a lot is, first the competitive nature. It's much more challenging to play against other humans than it is against any artificial intelligence in today's games. Maybe that's different 5 years, 10 years from now, but that's yet to be seen. So, and to really give yourself a challenge, I think it's great to play against other players. And then the human aspect of it is that, the people that you're playing against are other people just like you. They have jobs, they have families, they've got other things in their life going on. And you are kind of locked in this death match with them for months at a time, which I think is unique and interesting. You want to put on your best and beat this other person, but at the same time, it's like, well, they've got a family, they've got a life, they've got other things going on
they
too.
have
Like,
children.
yeah, exactly. Like I don't want to completely crush somebody's hopes and dreams and then they uninstall the game and never come back.
But that's the best part of Dominions.
Yeah, for some people that is a really fun part. It gets salty sometimes. People get pretty emotionally invested. And yeah, it's kind of weird. You have to like accept that, at some point we're gonna fight each other despite being friends. And It's very different than when you do something like chess, right? Because you're sitting down in a cage match and you guys are like, okay, we must fight each other, so there's no debatables here. But in Dominions, there's diplomacy, and a lot of people will be like, no, you shouldn't be attacking me. That's not the ideal play. You're being a jerk right now. And you have to explain to them, this isn't about me being a jerk. I think I'm going to win the game. So yeah, that part's really funny.
Yeah, it's interesting how different people react to it too. And, I think a lot of it overflows outside of the games too, in forums and other chat channels and Discord and everything too, because, it doesn't matter how one game played out, you might run into these same players in a future game. So I think everybody's careful about what they say, in when they're giving advice or tips or answering people's questions, because you might be playing against somebody and do some research across, just searching all the Discord forums and saying, oh, looks like they gave this answer to this question. That's not the right answer. I know they might have this weakness. And when I play against them in this game, I might be able to exploit that to my advantage. Or maybe I've played with this player enough times to know that they dislike diplomacy at all. So maybe I could use that to my advantage, coalition against them, and know that they are going to have a hard time breaking that coalition because they don't want to involve themselves with diplomacy with other players. So, I think, there's two aspects of it in game.
And how like detailed that gets. Like you just said, that's even stuff at a community level, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you do see it in, other games too. I played a bunch of StarCraft back in the day, but I was never, a top tier grandmaster level. But when you watch like the people that are quote unquote pros at some of those games, they're not just playing the game, they're playing the other people. Like they've matched against those people countless times in the ladder or one-on-one or practice or in their teams or, whatnot. And so they're not adjusting their strategies to what's going on tactically in the game. They're adjusting their strategies to what they know about those people or those players as people. And I think that's a really interesting thing that happens in Dominions earlier. Like you don't have to play thousands of hours across thousands of games to get to a grandmaster level, to get to that point where you're trying to play against the player and not the pieces on the board. So I think that's
definitely
very interesting.
Agree. I think Dominions is a bit of a weird, in terms of the community, it's kind of unusual because in a lot of like professional stuff like StarCraft and Dota and stuff, teams have crazy good strats, so they know some really specific strat that works really well. They keep it quite secret. They don't tend to reveal it. But Dominions players are pretty. I don't think there's any big secrets in Dominions that people don't like talk about or keep secret because it's giving them an advantage. So I think the community is actually pretty open in terms of like sharing knowledge and sharing like best play and stuff, which is really nice. But in terms of psychological warfare, I think people are pretty cutthroat. I know a lot of people that are very aggressive with like psychological pressure on other players in the games.
And yeah, I don't think games like, I mean, there are a lot of games where psychology gets into it, and like, certain sports where, you can't play as well because you're getting upset about losing, that sort of thing. But no, Dominions players get really into the psychological Diplo aspect of it, to where, regular communication is a form of a weapon for a lot of players. And even the lack thereof might be a calculated decision. So it's very unique in that aspect. And you have no idea if your opponent is one of those people that's using those types of tools, or if they just simply don't care and are responding the way that they're responding in that moment.
I think you have to get a feel for the players, because also like a lot of Dominions players think they're Machiavelli or something, and they're not Machiavelli. They're actually very obvious in what they're trying to do. But I think you can get a feel for when people are being genuine and when people are trying to be like very coy and secretive. And especially over, at the end of a game, you're going to know that fairly well. So in the future that, oh, this person is really untrustworthy and will try and play you in diplomacy constantly.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because I find that you get a lot of like, I don't know what to call it. It's like you get a big part of a community that tries to project like an honor system, or like the sense of honor, and then you'll play games with them, and then they'll do this complete move that's like, it's a loophole that they're exploiting in a situation to get around you. Um, but then on the other hand, it's like this whole sense of like, oh, you gotta do things honorably and that sort of stuff. And yet at the same time, you basically just broke our nap with a super shady move, or I asked you to help attack and nothing showed up, and you just said it's coming, it's coming, and then they end up breaking their nap with you and hitting you for it. So it's interesting because there's a lot of that. It's like honor signaling that people do they so that you'll feel like you can engage with them in Diplo because they must hold their end of the bargain. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's like the case where everyone says the same word, but they mean like a million different things. Like for a lot of people, honor is just what's convenient to them at the time. I think people tend to fall into two camps, which is either the super gameplay honorable or the super Diplo honorable. So Diplo people, just never break naps. They're very rigorous with their Diplo. They will do what they say, but they'll just do anything in the game. They will do any kind of underhanded thing. They'll do Ocelots with +8 attack and plus like 8 strength and 4 attack every game. They'll take every kind of gameplay advantage they can. And then you have the opposite. People are very won't use those tools, but then will just be like the most outrageous nap breakers, coalition makers, other underhanded diplomatic strats. So it's kind of interesting. And all those people would call themselves very honorable, I'm sure.
I mean, I think to be honest, I think you just kind of segregated two different big Discord communities.
Possibly.
Yeah, that sounds like, and that's an interesting thing too, is like these communities that get together and they communicate together, they form their own unique world of meta. And that meta makes certain nations more or less super terrible or super good to play in those kind of lobbies.
This is something that I've ranted about before, but I'm going to rant about now on a public platform. The Dominions, most people's opinion of nations are memes, and they're not actually based in reality, because most people don't play most nations, right? People's opinions on like Beratos, for example. People are like, oh, Beratos is a terrible, rushable nation. I don't think that's really true. It gets rushed by people a lot because it has this terrible reputation, but it's actually a fairly good nation to bounce rushes from. You can take loads of nice chassis. It has pretty solid mages. It has the nice sacred for defending rushes. And it's the same with a lot of other nations. And I think there's this like inertia from older players who have just like, oh yeah, Marverni, rushable, Beratos, rushable, Pan, super strong. Like there's all this sort of meme meta. And I really think that people need to start breaking it and they're just ignoring these. It's same with the tier list. There's a tier list going on in Lucid's chat at the moment. And I strongly don't agree with some of the positions of nations on those tier lists.
Oh yeah, that's another interesting one too, is the community's constantly changing their opinion on what's high tier, what's low tier, and as you'll see following like that tier list thread, you'll see those two different communities completely disagree with each other throughout the entirety of the thread. Now, the thread belongs to one of those Discord communities, so obviously it's going to shift more towards their beliefs, right? But you'll see the other group come in and be like, no, these are the bottom tier nations. Why are you ranking them so highly? And then it starts a little dispute about it. But it just goes to show like how loosely that meta is defined, but how constricted it could get with a certain community belief system.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially because the Dominions community has kind of a weird technocracy going on, right? Where the good players kind of have a big influence and like weight in these conversations. But then I've never played with half these people. I actually have no idea if any of these sort of big old players are actually any good at the game. I've never played games with them.
And that's something that's wild with Dominions is that 90% of the talking that's going on is talking. And I've spoken to many of these players before, and some of them, they play like a game a year.
Yeah. or they only play internal games with like their community, with like invite only games. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that in your invite only games, there's a few players who win a lot, but I don't know. I'm dubious. I'm very dubious about the sort of community standards for some things, because a lot of it is just based on a few people's opinion, or just like memes basically from these small communities.
Yeah, and it's kind of odd too. I've been in a few conversations recently about like win rates and things like that, because quite frankly, my win rate is not amazing by any means, but I keep hearing about people who win like, 100% of their games like 9 times as one nation, and I'm like, what? How is that even happening?
In fact, that's probably the other end of the spectrum, which is that if you join a bunch of noob games, yes, you're going to absolutely obliterate them if you know what you're doing.
It's just
I
like,
could
well,
very
are
easily
you
see
playing
myself
in your
going on a
community and your community just cannot answer that nation?
It could be. Like, I've got a 4 win streak, which we discussed before when you put this in the chat, but I have a 4 win streak on Therados. And yeah, people just kind of, you just grind people over. But a lot of those games, I think, was just very psychological. They were much bigger games. So a lot of people giving up, and I was just gobbling them all up until I got really huge.
One thing
I
I like about us trying to host a tournament too, is definitely what you just mentioned about how tournaments and tournament winning players tend to have more of a absolute value that is changing the community's meta, that is altering kind of the course of what people believe, and it's changing the way that a lot of games play out. And for me at least, a lot of nations get banned like 100% of the time, right? So some of the conversations can't even take place given what the meta can actually be, because those beliefs are still being carried out that, oh, this nation's got to be banned, this nation's got to be banned, or this nation's garbage and it shouldn't be played at all. And
yeah, and it's just with the bans, just to come into that, there's like a very weird thing going on with the bans. Like, no one, all the serious games, people just ban Nazca, right? They ban Ermor, they ban Nazca, they ban Lemuria, they ban Scalaria. Are they really supremely strong nations? Are they like in the hands of the average Dominion player so strong they have to be banned every game? Because you hear these stories of people like, yeah, Scalaria rolled over the game, but then it's like, oh, Scalaria played by like a really experienced player rolled over everyone in the game. And like Nazca, I don't actually think Nazca is as amazing as people think. We're playing it, and me and SR are playing it in a Disciples game. Yeah, it's a nice nation. You get a lot of sacreds, but the nation has no early game. The nation has a pretty weak mid game, and the super like amazing innate caster units are like a huge quantity of gold. You can't get a lot of them easily. I actually am not sure that Nazca is so powerful it needs to be banned every single game. It got picked a few times in the qualifiers for Lucy's tournament. It didn't win a single game. So is it really like the most powerful MA nation?
Yeah, I think a lot of nations are kind of in that bill. I know Fomoria is kind of that example for me. I've seen Fomoria in a ton of games, and they have had a very poor performance in the games that I've seen. But at the same time, that could be a factor of, are they new players, are they regular players, advanced players, things like that. But to say they're S tier, for me, that means I should be feeling like it's pretty unfair at every portion of the game, especially at the rate to ban them 100% of the time. I get they have a ton of really cool tools, though. That being said, so Yoshi, I think you're kind of on the opposite spectrum of this, where you're playing Agartha, right? Which is normally a nation that I think a lot of people would consider so low tier that they wouldn't want to play it in tournament play.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with everything you guys are saying for the past, 10, 15 minutes or whatnot. And it's actually baked into my strategy for Agartha. People, if you do a quick 5-second Google search, you could find those tier lists. People rate it as a C tier nation. You could search on Discord. People will say it's, bottom 4 nation, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, maybe they can't, snowball in certain situations, or, maybe there's some disadvantages, but every nation has some disadvantages. if you're the type of player that likes to play with flying units, well, you're going to think that LA Agartha is trash because there's not a single flying unit, right? I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think you got to take a look at, the nation like Agartha, and, I don't need an Awake Pretender to expand. I don't need a Bless to expand. I could use all those extra points and build, a middle game and late game plan and, make it to that point. Agartha's not necessarily a rush bait nation. If somebody rushes me, I could stack siege defense and hold out for pretty long. If they want to siege me, it's going to hurt them, in their next war, or they might get eaten up by somebody else I could diplo on their flank side while they're sitting on top of my fort for hours and hours, or turns upon turns. So, I think that when you take a look at some of those things like that. I think it all comes down to pretender design or builds. I think that's another part of the conversation too, where some people think that some nations are overpowered or underpowered because they listen to, the quote unquote experts. They do a 5-second Google search. They see a pretender design. They might copy it exactly or copy it 80% of the time and not sit down and really pick apart a nation to figure out, is there some way that I could put all these tools together in a way that I could execute a strategy at, some point in the game. It takes a lot of upfront, work, but I think it kind of pays off in your game. If you're going to be locked into a game for months upon months, taking one turn a day, I think doing a little prep work ahead of time, definitely pays off and makes it much more enjoyable.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting too, because a lot of the guides, I mean, they've floated around for so long, and there was kind of like a mass transition I think the community had from like Dom 4 to Dom 5, where they went and like wiped, I think, like the whole wiki of all the different strategies that were on there for nations. There was kind of like I don't know how to put it, like a meta purging that I think was kind of going on.
Yeah. I don't remember that, but I kind of came into the game just a couple years ago, so I don't have really a solid knowledge of Dom 4 or anything before.
Or I guess back then, or early Dom 5, the All Nations Guide, that was another pretty big one. And I think since then opinions on that have faded out. It's that one that has like every single nation listed on it in that forum.
It's kind of handy for beginners. It's a good noob tool.
Yeah, I've definitely relied on it when I first started playing, but the more I play, the less I relied on it. If I'm picking up a new nation for the first time, I might skim it just for some general ideas. But I like figuring out things my own way. I like treating everything as like a puzzle, and you're trying to thread this needle. It's a super small needle with a super fine piece of thread. But if you could get that thing to work, you could obliterate somebody's death ball and then march on their capital and, win the game. So, I kind of take those guides, just as like a rough pass just to get my bearings. And then I try to figure out like, where can I thread this needle in the safest way possible to clinch that win.
So I got an interesting question for you, Tlaloc. And this is kind of with I know you have some pretty strong opinions on, nation performance versus, is it really a hard nation to play, or does the nation really just suck? How much of that do you think is do you think a lot of that is more clear and cut? Or do you think if you go to like Immersion or go to Lucids or even our own Discord, do you think the opinion of that changes the perspective of that nation so much in a lobby of these size that it actually does influence their performance?
So you mean like how does players' opinions of other nations affect?
Yeah, and how much of, like, for instance, when you think of a strong nation that is better than others, or you think of a bad nation that is worse than others, how much do you think that performs differently if you played in a lobby of community A versus community B just because of those perspectives? Do you have like nations where you think they're bad across both lobbies no matter what, or they're like the best across both lobbies no matter what?
So my perspective is kind of the inverse of that. I'll get onto because people do think that, and I've had experiences like that have been really weird. But I genuinely try not to judge nations on their like strength. Really, like you can make tier lists, but I genuinely think that most nations have strengths to them that you have to consider, and I do consider it. And it affects how I play against them. But I think the real thing is actually between lobbies. In my opinion, the real difference is just how players play strategically more than like play the nations. I think most people play the nations more or less the same in general. But like some lobbies, like for example, Dominion's Nexus, it has a lot of noobs and a lot of players who are very anti-diplo or do some very weird and questionable diplomacy. I play differently on that server to other servers. You can be much more of a mercenary on Dominion's Nexus than you can on Lucid server. Because if you do something on Lucid server, people are going to call you out and you're going to get in trouble. But I've done all sorts of terrible things on Dominion's Nexus and I haven't been called out or had any repercussions at all in the future. So, but the reverse is true. So what you're actually talking about, I think other people do have this opinion. So some people will tell me like, oh, I declared war on you because you're a strong nation. I'm like, what? It doesn't make any sense. Like one person was playing EA Ulm and I was EA Tin and Nog, and they just declared war on me out of nowhere because I was playing Tin and Nog, and they wanted to like slow me down. I was like, that is such a bad perspective, I think, to have on the strengths, the difference between nations and strength. Like you've got to take it into account, but you can't let your strategy and your gameplay be dominated by just outside opinions and like sort of. Like you've got to play the player and you've got to play how they're playing in that game. You can't play on these memes and you can't play on these big meta ideas. I think you've got to just play each game as its own game.
I think I see what you're saying because, and this kind of goes into people's like default modes, I think, where because you're next to something that you read about in the meta or because you've heard this nation can do X, instead of seeing the game state where it's at, you go back to that advice and you're just like, okay, I'm going to follow this direct advice about this nation being scary.
And it really affects some people. Like you can play some nations in actually really different ways. Like Middle Age Agartha, for example, you can take it in a lot of different directions with like what kind of summons you make, how you use the summons. If you've built a big bless for the Shard God or for the summons, you can play the nation in lots of different ways. And if you just fight every MA Agartha like it's the same MA Agartha, you're going to lose because you're not going to be prepared for what's actually going to happen. Yeah, and it's the same for a lot of other nations.
Yeah, I think a tough part too is at least for a lot of the new player side is sometimes you're like, oh, I should fight them because they're strong, but that's actually the opposite of what you would want to do to be able to actually win the game.
Exactly. Also, in a tangent to this, which is kind of a bit of a big tangent, but piecing out. So the reverse of this, stop fighting people when you're not going to gain anything. You shouldn't fight people you're not going to gain anything from, but you should also just stop fighting when it's clearly a stalemate or like a draw. And this is something that servers differ on as well. Like some servers are much more willing to piece out and just be like, fine, we'll do something else. But some servers, people are so into the sunk cost fallacy, they will grind into each other for months of real time instead of just piecing out and doing something else.
Oh, yeah.
They're clearly making no progress.
The system has a lot to do with that too, actually, because a lot of those people who want to grind out, they think by grinding out, they're protecting their reputation from you in future games.
Exactly. But honestly, I respect people willing to make a peace if, the war's not going anywhere or you're fighting this like no man's land with nothing to gain from each other and you just keep trading these big stack wipes. I think at that point, you've just got to peace out. Like, there's just no point. It's a waste of real time and it's a waste in the game of like your resources.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think also player experience comes into that a little bit too, where people don't want to back out of a war because they think they're like, oh, I'm just one more turn away, just one more battle away. Like, if I could just do this one thing or capture this one province, I could flip it on its head. But I think a more experienced player would see that, the cost is already sunk. Like, even if you turn it around, you're so far away from first place because you guys have both taken so much attrition that, some other players snowballed ahead, drastically. And so, I think it's that experience thing. It's almost like, going back to some of these other games like StarCraft, like to win StarCraft, the goal is to blow up all of your opponent's buildings, right? But no game ever lasts that long, but noob games do. You have noobs that, lift off their command center, fly it into a corner. Haha, you can't beat me. I'm going to draw this out for another 20 minutes until you build up some air units and then come chase me down. And so I think some of that happens in the game too, that you have those different levels of experience. And you don't really know what kind of game you're in until, you've played several months of time, or maybe you've encountered that player before. So, I think that might be part of the key too, is figuring out, when do I need to back out of this war, but also what type of player am I playing against? Are they somebody who doesn't even realize that backing out is the best option at this point? And what can I do to convince them to, turn that around? And then you're playing that mind game again, rather than playing with pieces on a board.
I think it's really hard too. Like what you guys were mentioning on sunk cost. I think it's hard to understand how much you actually lost when you lose something. And it's sometimes way more expensive than you think it actually was, until you actually like start calculating out, what is it that I just lost in this fight, but I think I can turn around if I get this other thing to happen. And it's sort of this issue of where you're playing a game of like 10% statistics, but the amount that you're losing is, you're losing like 10 turns of work at a time from the last stack that you lost, even though you think you could flip this next thing around. And I think like bad SC plays, bad thug plays, or doom stacking way too hard when you don't have the right amount of things to protect it, is where that goes to the extremes. It'll be mid game and someone loses like a 300 gem commitment, or an 8,000 gold stack, and they're still in this mindset of, well, I could still get my revenge if I just flip this one province, or if I get this next one. But you're never making those 10 to 20 turns back.
Erathsmus?
Oh, yeah. Did we lose you?
Oh, hello. Am I there?
Hello? There you are.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You're back.
Oh, where did I cut off? My bad.
Something about 300 gem investment.
Yeah, if you could just, and then you left us hanging.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was... my bad. I don't know what happened there. But yeah, it was just, you lose a lot more than you actually see a lot of the times. And losing a stack even mid game, it could be like an 8,000 gold investment, a 200, 300 gem investment. And people don't consider that, that was 10 to 15 turns they just lost compared to their neighbor who was not exchanging like that.
It's true.
Yeah.
It can be the case. It's kind of weird as well, because Dominion's turns fundamentally have like a finite number of turns, probably. Like most games are not going to go beyond turn 100. So you actually start to get a weird reverse in the calculus, I think, of how much to invest later in the game. Because if you're on turn 90 and it's only a turn 100 game, anything you lose now is just gone. You're never going to recover it. You're never going to build back to that kind of previous state you had. So I think the sort of like calculus of how much to risk in battles actually really changes over a game, which people fall trapped to, because in mid game is probably the best time to deploy these like humongous armies, because it's not going to be any big remote spells. It's probably not going to be any like ultra SCs. It's the best time to really put all your power onto the field and like take stuff. But people keep doing this later and later into the game, and they put their super amazing army out on like turn 70 and something, and it just gets completely obliterated. And that's it. They can't make that army again. There's not enough time left in the game for them to recover to that point. So the sort of, which I think is one of the reasons late games become such a drag, is because people don't play into this. As the games go later, you actually need to start committing less and less to every battle. You need to be way more economical and like cut it much closer to the win, because you just can't afford to take these big losses.
Yeah, and I've noticed too, and the tougher the lobbies get in terms of player skill, the more that late game becomes even mid game.
Yeah, well, like the rule for most RTSs and like MOBA games, which Dominion is kind of like, is that the more skilled the game is just faster. You just bring all the timings back. That's like the main difference between games. It's just bringing these timings back and like micro skills.
Yep, because and that's the thing. You'd maybe hear someone say like, "Oh, you could run around with stacks in the mid game and things like that." But if you didn't properly prepare for that, you could easily get hit by a mono drop like turn 22, turn 25, and well, there goes your whole stack too.
Yeah, I've experienced that recently.
Yeah,
it was very
those
upsetting.
are pretty classic. and there's another player, and it's interesting. I do agree a lot mechanically with a lot of the immersion players' opinions on this, in that, if you're running around with big stacks in general in an advanced lobby, you're probably going to get some very large costs associated with that. And it could not even be from your enemy. Somebody else could just notice, oh, hey, there's this stack that's missing this one res. I'm just going to go swoop that up right now. And a lot of people might say, well, that's being a looter. Like, that's not being, why would you just randomly attack my stack if I wasn't at war? Well, if you just wipe someone's entire stack off the face of the planet, that's huge. That's a huge benefit to you if you could manage to, pick up those lands afterwards, even if you weren't at war to begin with. So
in my qualifier game, so this is a good example of what you're talking about. In my qualifier game for the tournament, there were a lot of people bringing quite late into the game, like turn 60 plus, smashing their mega doom stacks together. And I was Vanheim, and I just every time I saw a big army battle about to happen, I just gem baited both armies, because what it meant was all the battles would turn into these horrifying bloodbaths because no one would have any spells. Everyone was super weak, but these huge armies would just smash into each other. And like this Ashdod player in my game, he got pretty hammered early on, but he managed to get a decent position, and he spent about 50 turns building back into this great position, and he lost every single unit basically he owned in this one massive battle. And it's like, you just got to be ready for that. And we're not using gem gens in this game. That had gem gens as well. So in this game, we're not using gem gens. People have just got to be ready for people to gem bait, possibly multiple people to gem bait. I don't think it's possible to make an army immune to being gem baited by like 3 players.
Yeah, that is extremely difficult to do. And I think the more you're able to just tighten that, where, that mindset that a doom stack is not really a good thing. That's a doom stack is a liability. It's a major liability, and it's only a good thing unless you can protect it from absolutely everything. And I don't know. I think that mindset kind of leaves a lot of players' heads, because they'll play in other lobbies where their doom stack, just walks up to someone's capital, takes the capital because that player gave up or something like that. But there's times when you'll walk your doom stack to someone's capital, and on the way there, that thing just gets completely fried if other players see it. And turn 60, like, that's really late to be doing things like that. But at the same time, there are some nations that can still field things that don't get wiped off the face of the earth. So that's obviously a different level, where, an advanced player has probably already known what could wipe that doom stack and is prepared properly for it. But like you said with gem baits, that can fry the ability to protect those armies too.
Oh, sorry, it's my dog. Do you guys think that this conversation also ties into people thinking certain nations are balanced or not balanced? Like, for example, if you had a doomstack or a thug or a super combatant, and let's maybe take a thug, for example, that, you lost your thug, it was equipped with a handful of items. You might look at that and say, well, I'm out, 40, 50, 60 gems, but not realizing the total cost of what was lost. And then all of a sudden you're in the situation that you're thinking, oh, this other nation is overpowered because they killed my one thug and I just can't recuperate from it. But in reality, it's maybe 1 turn to summon the thug, X amount of gems for that, X amount of turns to forge each one of those items, you might need to think about, can I reforge them concurrently? Or one a turn, maybe you only have one mage that has the right paths to forge those items, so it's going to take you several turns. When you add up all those turns, and then you also look that, maybe the gems I need, I only have the income of maybe 3, something gems a turn. All of a sudden, that one thug you lost is 20, 30 turns, all bundled together.
Yeah.
And not being able to calculate that as a player, or not really realizing that true cost of what was lost, do you think that factors into thinking that, oh, well, this nation's weak or that nation's full or something?
I think for the powerful thing, it definitely does. This, especially for elf, I think I have 2 points actually. I think for elf nations, people see elves doing elf things and stuff and other things, like cloud trapezing, Vanyel thugs or She-Lord thugs around the map. And they're like, oh, elves are incredibly powerful. But like every single one of those, you cannot just take a province with just a She-Lord or a Vanyel. It needs thug items. It really needs a Vine Shield to pin all the PD down. It probably needs some sort of AoE weapon to clear the PD. That's pretty expensive. And Vanheim doesn't get... It works way better on like the She nations because they get water and nature passively. But Vanheim doesn't get nature gems and it doesn't get water gems. So every time... That massive elf thing is a huge commitment from the elf player to build up that capability. And if you can lose that capability, which happens to me a few times. So sometimes you just get your raiding force really whittled down, or just they're so ready to counter it, you can't do anything anyway with the raiders. And that's a huge commitment by Vanheim that's now been pretty much completely countered.
I think one thing that's a tough pill for me to swallow in a lot of regards, particularly with this conversation, and actually when it comes down to nation rankings, like on their tiers and stuff like that, is there's some nations where almost no matter what you do, you can't get a stack that will not be wiped.
I don't agree. Maybe on like Pelagia, EA Pelagia or something.
Like a lot of the small humans, for example, if you don't have the appropriate paths to be able to get resistances and that sort of thing, and if you lose those mages, they're like your only one-off mage for being able to get that. I think there's really a tough part about, come turn 60, some other nations can field units with full resists, the full paths to get everything working, and they won't die from something like a mono drop or from 2 different wipes dropping on it at the same time, that kind of stuff. Those gaps I find to be the really hard part for some nations versus others, and I guess more challenging lobbies, at least from my end.
I can agree with that, and you kind of saw it actually in Lucid's last tournament. The Ulm player started to really struggle at as you got past the mid game. The middle-aged Ulm player really started to struggle to put together stacks that could like competitively fight with the other big nations. And they were still struggling to put down the Satis player, because obviously Satis was putting up Foul Vapors like every battle. Ulm had to have Foul Vapors casters in every single group that went out, or they would just take so much attrition. But that's kind of the trade-off with these nations. Like, obviously some nations have slightly worse rosters than others, but if you're taking one of these big scales or humans nations, you've got to go into the game thinking, how do I get Omni resists in my big stacks? How do I get this as soon as possible? That has to be part of the strategy, because you have a lot of strengths, and those are your weaknesses. Your weaknesses are elites, and your weaknesses are battlefield wipes and magic. And you've got to, if you don't plan that ahead, then you're gonna get messed up.
Yeah. I think just that tough part of needing those irreplaceable, I guess, mages to even walk around on the map is the big pain point.
But I'll give you a perspective from someone who plays lots of nations with few troops that are elite, like elf nations. Is the reverse is true for that, is that I am horrified. Every time you commit your elves to battle, there is the risk that you lose everything. You lose your entire elf stack and you're done. because you can't get enough fans to fill in like in a new army. So elves have the reverse problem, which is they're probably immune to most of the bullshit. But if they get hit by one Murdering Winter or Flames from the Sky or just pinned by some stupid SC and like routed, you're done. So you got to be super careful, like super duper careful with these like little elf armies where you position them and move them around the map. So there is still that element of fear and like that problem. It's just that people tend to be better at deploying battlefield wipes where you just press a button than deploying like really complex SCs or like hitting you with Flames from the Sky properly.
Yeah, and I think that button definitely, at a certain turn, it just becomes a button at that point.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we've gone a decent chunk over our time, but that's all good. It was an interesting conversation. I think the lobbies look all pretty interesting for EA, MA, LA. I think personally, Tlaloc, I think you got your hands full with that one. I think MA is going to be a pretty bizarre one on the Diplo side, at least. Yoshi, I'm going to be very interested to hear about how Agartha's going to go as well. It's not played very often in these kind of settings, so that should be pretty cool.
Yeah, and like I said, my goal isn't to become the number one player in this round. I just want to squeeze into that fourth spot and then make it to the next round. My strategy, if I do make it to the next game, my strategy will be completely different. I think it also might buffer me against the other players too, since they might not know what I'm capable of if I'm just playing in a mediocre game just to squeeze that fourth spot. So we'll see if that mind game works out or not. It's a little experiment if it does.
Nice.
Yeah, if I get to the finals, I'm playing Pop Kill 100%. I'm going to play something really obnoxious. Going to drag it out.
I was thinking of. I was like, okay, I bet when finals are going to happen, then people are like, okay, I want to get number one. And they're going to be like, I don't care about the score anymore.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Well, how are we doing the age selection for the final round?
Random.
I had an idea, which is that we should do a one age game and everyone plays the same nations again.
Oh my gosh. That would be, oh man, that would be rough. It would be really rough because then everybody saw how we played our nations or saw half of our interviews on how we played them. So we'd have to come up with something totally different.
That is true, actually.
Yeah.
It'd be funny though.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I would pick a completely different pretender build. But then again, you might not. And then, it'd be a total surprise, even if you're on the same nations.
Yeah, I think I definitely got the pick that I think was more sketchy in terms of what I would have wanted to run for a lobby like that. But I didn't know what the picks were going to be in EA. Turns out that it's a pretty rush heavy EA, so it should be a interesting time. I don't even know what I would do for the final. I changed my picks like 20 different times just for this one.
I picked Lemuria, and Lemuria didn't get picked in the LA. So if I was in the LA lobby, I'd be playing Lemuria.
Nice. That would have changed the whole LA is looking pretty nice conversation really quick.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna head off, you guys. It's I'm gonna go play some tennis.
Fair enough.
There you go.
I'm gonna go make dinner.
All right.
Yeah. Before we
thanks for your
wrap
time,
things...
Tlaloc and Yoshi. Sorry. What were you saying?
I was going to say, before we wrap things up, I just want to thank Clockwork and MapNuke and the other tools that we use in the community. And I just want to encourage people to donate whatever they can. I know everybody's financial situation is different, and full disclosure, I'm not a member of any of these things, so I'm not trying to sell my own stuff here. But yeah, just donate whatever you can. It helps keep things moving along and gives us some fun games.
Oh, yeah, that's a pretty nice call out. They definitely keep the community going. That's for sure.
I mean, I don't know what we do without someone. If the bot didn't exist, someone would just have to make it. So I'm glad they did.
Yeah.
All right. Well, have a good one, guys. Thanks for your time.
Okay. Thanks, Erathsmus.
All right. Thank you.